Welcome into another edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jeff Cohen. And today we welcome on Jack McMullen of Just Baseball. Super excited to have Jack on today. He's been on the show once before with me, and now we get an episode with the three of us to talk White Sox ball. He doesn't like to admit it, but Jack is a Chicago White Sox fan from early in his life. But we're super pumped. This is our first episode of 2025, and we're excited. We're almost a month away from spring training, and we've got a ton to talk about. The White Sox head into 2025 with, a win total set at 50 games. But with that said, a little more excitement than at least at the end of last year. There's a lot of young players. There's a lot of guys we're expecting to see in the big league this year. And just, some buzz in an otherwise, tough time to be a White Sox fan. So first of all, Jack, welcome in, man. Appreciate you taking the time.
100%, man. I really like that video intro. Did you ever play Fruit Ninja, the iPhone game? It felt like Fruit Ninja, where you got to slash all the logos in half. I
Some
love
Fruit
that.
Ninja stuff.
Yeah. But no, appreciate you guys having me. That's a tough win total that you mentioned here. I think you're 49.5.
Yeah.
I mean, man, all right.
Yeah, it's low. Jeff, how are you doing? How's the new year treating you so far?
No complaints, all good. I'm really fired up about Jack, but I have some mixed emotions. I'm hoping none of my fantasy baseball opponents are watching because Jack's where I get a lot of my great prospect information.
Good.
So, and in fact, I'm going to go ahead and plug his most recent podcast now because he just in his last podcast talked about who were going to be the first man up for every team in the National League. Yeah. So again, I'm hoping none of those opponents are paying too close of attention.
100%.
Yeah, so we got a lot to kind of just go over and get your takes on, Jack, and just talk about everything as we gear up for baseball season. It's kind of crazy because this offseason has been really active, but it's also like sort of flown by. We're a month out of pitchers and catchers reporting, and then before you know it, we're going to be at spring training, spring breakout, all this stuff coming up. So how are you just kind of feeling about the offseason and just the landscape of baseball heading into this season?
Off-season feels long until January 4th
Right.
or 5th. And then you see Max Clark tweet that he's driving to Lakeland, getting ready for the season. And you see, certain pitchers reporting, and, it's not a concrete report because pitchers and catchers reporting we know is, in mid-February, right around Valentine's Day. But, seeing guys go to get their early work in now, and this is when the prep for the 2025 season really starts for everybody. It's a fascinating time, and I love this time because it feels like we are turning the page now. There's been so much recap. There's been too much recap of the 2024 season. I'm ready to, flip the page and move on to 25.
Yeah, I'm here for it. I think we're ready to gear up and just look into things. As we look at the White Sox here in particular going into the season, this offseason has been about what we expected. I think that's fair to say. I mean, it's, there was never an expectation of this team making huge moves, right? The Crochet deal is obviously the biggest thing that we're going to get into, in addition to the fact that, otherwise it's been, Austin Slater, Mike Tauchman, Josh Rojas. It's been a lot of, 1 year guys where it's like maybe there's something and you flip them at the deadline for a flyer prospect and maybe they're absolutely nothing. And that's pretty much how this offseason feels. But, the biggest thing coming into the offseason was like, you got to trade Crochet and you have to find as much value for him as possible. And I think by all means, the trade was one that you feel pretty good about. So what is the offseason kind of along the lines of what you expected? And how does it look from, the perspective of the White Sox?
Yeah, well, let me write down on my notes app real quick. Elijah Evans noted not fired up about the Austin Slater, Mike Tauchman platoon. That's unfortunate, but you know what? We march on. I think they did the right thing when it came to maximizing on Crochet. It's not like his value is going to get any greater because he was as good as you could possibly anticipate him being in 2024, even with, a tapered off slate after the All-Star break. And that tapered off slate was still 3 innings, 8 Ks sometimes. And it was really fun to watch. His numbers were somehow like looking at the end of the year, I thought he was even better than some of the numbers indicated. So this was the time to move Garrett Crochet. Robert, there's a conversation there. I think that the sooner you can move Robert and recoup on some of that value, the better. But they've done the right thing, trading the big fish. And the complementary pieces here are Rojas, a Tauchman. They're not going to, mean anything the long term of the White Sox. I think they're going to be guys that are going to be good, immaculate grid answers in 3 years. But, I think they are building for the future, and they've got a couple guys, especially from that Crochet deal and some of the trades, in previous deadlines that I think are going to factor into 2025. And we were looking for a little bit of excitement, just trace amounts, and we are going to get that in 25.
Yeah. So let's get into that trade more because I think, like you said, the other moves are, around the margins, right? The Crochet deal. What is your kind of take on some of those players and compared to like the general perspective? Because for me, like when me and Jeff talked about it, like I think all of us at FutureSox, like we're pretty high on Brady Montgomery. I think the general consensus is, he's a top 100 prospect, but I think there's still a lot of question marks. He hasn't played a minor league game yet, right? Like you need to see it to believe it. But I think generally we all kind of see him as, could be the headline of this deal, right? In terms of, upside, right? Kyle Teal, you've got a projectable college guy with experience, can be that, hopeful tandem with Caro going forward. And then, Chase Meadroth, who is going to be at least, a utility piece to add to the fold, right?
Yeah.
What is your kind of sense of these players compared to what the general perspective on those four guys that came back were?
Yeah, I mean, I think Braden Montgomery is going to be the best player in the return. I know that a lot of people want to side with Kyle Teal being the best player in the return. I think Kyle Teal can be a good catcher. I think he can be, an above league average offensive piece, and I think that he can be fine behind the plate. But I think that there already is a catching prospect in the system with an identical ETA. I think Edgar Caro played 38 games in Charlotte and Teal played 36 in Worcester, or those numbers are reversed. They are at the same place in their maturation as a catching prospect. I think the White Sox already had the better one. But you can run out the two catcher thing. I mean, I've talked about that. Like, I wish Toronto did that with Kirk and Gabby Moreno instead of trading him to Arizona. And, there are other catching tandems that I think make sense. And I do think that we're going to see, Rutschman and Basayo become a catching tandem in Major League Baseball. There is something that exists here with the White Sox that gives you the idea of, hey, Teal and Caro can be a catching tandem for the next 6-7 years of White Sox baseball. But I do think Braden Montgomery is going to be the best player in that return because this is a guy that scrapped pitching to become a 30 homer guy in college baseball in the SEC. And you don't get that often. He's a switch hitter, clearly good feel for the bat. And I mean, he's got insane pop. And he was a guy that was up to the high 90s on the mound. He moves well enough, and we'll see what he looks like after he recovers from that broken leg fully. And it sounds like he is there at this point. I mean, he could blossom into a very, very good right fielder with a cannon for an arm. And if you give me 30 homer upside, I'll take that over, a guy that I think is going to be a mid-level catcher.
Jack, when do you see these guys in Chicago?
Teal very soon. I look at the catching tandem right now and I say, okay, do we want Corey Lee and Matt Tice, or do we want Edgar Caro and Kyle Teal? And I know which one I want. And I don't know when that's going to be. Is it going to be May? Is it going to be June? I could see them figuring out the timeshare in Charlotte and then bringing them up at pretty much the same time to do an identical timeshare in Chicago. So Teal and Caro, I could see June, probably early to mid-June. Montgomery is probably going to take a bit. I bet he debuts in high A with a quick bump to double A. And you may see him in September. You may also see him as a break camp candidate in 2026. My draw, to spoil something I know that you want to talk about, Jeff, a little bit later on, there's no reason for him not to be on the roster on opening day. Like zero. He's a net positive when, it comes to second base, shortstop, third base, wherever you want to put him.
Yeah, and he got the games, right? Like he got 122 games in AAA. So it's not like you're looking at a Meadroth and saying, oh, he needs more time, he needs more seasoning. 122 games for his profile, especially in AAA, is plenty.
Well, and with what, a 437 OBP, 440. I don't have it in front of me, but I know
437. That's insane.
There we go. So that's too much time on Fangraphs. I'm sorry. I have a problem. But it's one of those situations where, like, okay, you've got a guy that spent an entire year in Worcester and was really good in Worcester. So reward him. And it's not like the White Sox need to see more run time from a big league second base option right now. Like, hey, do you want to see Lenine Sosa play every day and Brooks Baldwin play every day? Or do you want to cycle Meadroth in with those guys and you figure it out? Baldwin, I think, should be playing 120 games this year for the White Sox. Sosa, I don't know. It's kind of for you to decide how many games you want to see him play, but I do think that Meadroth is probably an upgrade over Lenine Sosa on opening day.
Yeah. So where it becomes tricky though with a Meadroth, right? And you mentioned Baldwin, you mentioned Lenine Sosa, right? Like Vargas, Miguel Vargas, Brian Ramos, Colson Montgomery, Josh Rojas now in the mix for infield time. Like, it's weird because there's nobody you're super, super high on heading into the season in the infield, but there's also now a lot of guys actually. So it becomes a little bit complicated to figure out what that means. Like for me, like I'm okay moving on from Lenny and Sosa being at the big league level personally, but the White Sox are still going to get Miguel Vargas. Like he was the headline of a big deal last year. Like you're going to get him innings. Brian Ramos got a chance last year, but really didn't get a full time to run, right? And then you've got Brooks Baldwin, you've got Josh Rojas, and then you've got a Maidroth, right? And then so it becomes a little bit complicated to figure out that infield. But I do agree that Maidroth is a guy that, like, of those guys in that trade package, like, there's no reason he shouldn't be up soon. And it just becomes about figuring out the timing. What is before we get into more of that, the rest of like what things go moving forward, Wilkerman Gonzalez, the last name, who I think we haven't quite talked about enough from that package. This is a guy who was really good in 2023. Like when I first saw the trade, I recognized the name. I knew who he was. I remember seeing some stuff, but then I looked into it and I was like, this guy was, a Red Sox top 10 guy after 2023, the way he had thrown. Last year, he definitely took a step back, but the stuff is still pretty high level. And I know there's a lot of pitchers in the system, but do you kind of have any idea of his projection, or what do you think of his potential as a starter, or does he end up just being, a high stuff reliever?
I think he's got a lot of reliever risk, and I don't want to call it risk because the stuff is very good. And it's mid to high 90s fastball. It's decent enough shape, and he's got a good breaking ball as well. But Wilkerman Gonzalez's biggest competition in 2024 was Wilkerman Gonzalez. He walked 40 something in 83 innings, and it didn't jive well. When he was more around the strike zone, he was beating guys at the lower levels in 2023, and that's why you saw the quality numbers. Opponents are not going to hit 200 against him in minor league baseball. They haven't in each of the past 2 years, but the question is, what does the whip look like? What does the left on base look like? Because you run yourself into trouble and you get burned twice in a start, you're going to allow 4 or 5 earned runs, and that's not going to work, especially at the big league level. They have better zone pounders than Wilkerman at this point. I think he's going to go to Birmingham, and I think he's probably going to show pretty well because he would be repeating Double-A. And I think that's a guy that feels similar to Prelander Baroa in a way, because Baroa was a very talented starter that couldn't really find the strike zone. They move him to the pen. It looks better. He looks like a big leaguer. Wilkerman could figure it out, and if he's pounding the strike zone in Birmingham to open the year, you still try the starter thing because you got plenty of time. But I do see a Baroa type progression with him where he could just turn into that promising reliever that you can get up sooner rather than later.
Jack, that's a good segue to talk about these tons of starting pitchers in the upper levels for the White Sox. I mean, we could rattle off 10.
Right.
And so I'm curious to get your thoughts as to who you think at the end of the day are going to be the standouts among Thorpe and Lestrini, Iriarte, and on and on.
I like watching Cannon, man. I really do. And I know that it can be finicky at points and starts can get away from him sometimes, but I'm excited to see what Cannon can do in 2025. I think he's going to start opening day, which is crazy. And I mean, we were laughing at Crochet getting the ball on opening day because he hadn't made a start since he was in Knoxville, Tennessee. But I mean, you know what? Like, it worked for them. Cannon is the most exciting one for me that's going to open on the big league roster. I still really like Thorpe. I love watching that changeup. And I'm excited about Sean Burke at the big league level, too. Davis Martin was the guy that jumped out to me in 2022. I was like, this is a guy. Like, he can throw it. So I do think that the rotation as a whole in the big leagues on opening day is in a better spot than it was last year when we were having that conversation, because we didn't know what Crochet was going to blossom into. I wonder how they handle that Birmingham rotation from 2024, because Schultz is not going to be on the club on opening day. Iriarte might. What role is Iriarte going to fill? But then, a Mason Adams, even a Grant Taylor who's coming off of injury. Like, these are guys that I'm curious what the assignment is going to be and how long they're going to be there. You don't really want to send too many starters to Charlotte, because Charlotte is as close to the Pacific Coast League as we have. I mean, it's a bandbox, and you don't want to mess with Noah Schultz's confidence level. I don't see the point in him starting a game in Charlotte, to be honest. I would send Schultz to Birmingham, and as soon as you deem him ready, you get him to Chicago. They did that with Thorpe. Like, I feel like those guys that were dominant in Birmingham are just going to go back. And then you have those tweeners like a Nastrini and a Kai Bush that are probably going to be in the Charlotte rotation to open the year.
Right. That's completely right. I think that's pretty spot on. I mean, I think the guys you mentioned with Burke, Cannon, and then Davis Martin and Thorpe, I think those are kind of your four that you can not pencil in. You got to see how they come into the spring, but I think those are the four that are definitely probable to be in the rotation. And then it's, is it another free agent ad potentially, or is it one of those Nastrini, Bush, Iriarte? I think Iriarte probably still needs more time if they want him to be a starter, right? Like I think the little 1 month of being a reliever last year in Chicago, like that was more just to get everybody's hands on him, to get Ethan Katz seeing him, to get Bannister kind of being working with him, seeing what he's got. Like I think they still view him as a starter, in which case he needs more time to be down in the minors still with some of those other guys. And then my question beyond Noah Schultz, right? I think we've agreed, me and Jeff have said multiple times, like Schultz should be in Birmingham. When he's ready, he comes to Chicago. Like that seems like the obvious path. It's Thorpe, but an even higher level of a pitcher. Like he's a whole other tier of Thorpe, and that's what they did with Thorpe last year. So I don't see why they wouldn't with Schultz.
Right.
But then it's like, what does the Higgins Smith trajectory look like? Because in addition to Grant Taylor too, right? Like there's a lot of guys in this rotation that are good right now. The guys that you look at and say, these guys can be great is Noah Schultz and Higgins Smith. And it starts there and ends there, right? Like there is other guys that you really are excited about, but those are the two guys that you think can be leading that group of young pitchers ultimately in a couple years from now. So what do you see Higgins Smith trajectory looking like, considering he had, 4 starts in high A and that was it last year?
Let's project Birmingham this bad boy with the starting rotation. Like let's just get everybody back in Birmingham, Alabama. I think you should, from a player development perspective, you should concentrate all of your best prospects in a certain, facet if they have a similar timeline. Like Colson Montgomery being in Birmingham during the Project Birmingham era and Wes Koth being there didn't make any sense whatsoever because they weren't ready to see Double-A pitching. But Hagen Smith is ready to face Double-A hitting. Noah Schultz is clearly okay facing Double-A hitting. So is Jairo Iriarte. Why would you not concentrate your 3 best minor league pitching prospects in the same place where you can send all of your rovers, all of your coordinators, and it's one-stop shopping. Hey, I'm going to spend 60% of my time this year in Birmingham, and I'm going to check in on Winston-Salem and Kannapolis and Charlotte. Obviously, you like to spray the board a little bit, and like, hey, give every guy a chance to shine and be, the front of their affiliates rotation, but I don't think that's really beneficial. I think with pitching and starting pitching in particular, if guys have a similar ETA, and I think the ETA for college baseball players now, pitcher or hitter, is as close as it's ever been from when they're drafted to when they'll debut. Skeens did not need to throw a pitch in the minor leagues. I don't think Rhett Lauder needed to throw many pitches in the minor leagues. Like Chase Dolander threw an entire year in the minor leagues. He shouldn't throw another in the minor leagues. Hagen Smith is cut from that cloth. So is Chase Burns in Cincinnati out of Wake Forest. I think Smith and Schultz should be in Birmingham, and they could come up on the same exact day.
Jack, Elijah and I have talked about the pitching depth, and last year the strength of the Birmingham team was the rotation with Thorpe and Iriarte, and possibly the best Double-A rotation in baseball. And this year has the potential to be better.
Yeah,
because you've got Aldrin Batista there as well, as your number 4 guy.
I mean, Juan Carrella too. Like there's the names go on, and there's a lot of guys, but I think you're spot on with the Schultz and Smith assessment there. I think that both those guys, like, I don't see a reason for them ever to be in Charlotte. I think they're both already. I think Smith is already ready for Birmingham, right? Even Grant Taylor, I think, could be in Birmingham. I think maybe Grant Taylor starts in Winston just because the injuries and he kind of had a rough whatever. But like sooner than later, like the concentration of all those the next tier of arms should be in Birmingham because there's no reason for it not to be. In addition to the fact that Birmingham's just a good place to pitch, right? Like, and you want to have these guys building confidence. Of course, you don't want to make them overconfident that they're just going to dominate at every level, but at the same time, like, you want them building the confidence, getting hitters out and attacking guys at that level.
The best crops of prospects move together. You think about the Baltimore Orioles in recent years, and like Gunnar was at the same level as all of these guys, and even this year, like Kobe Mayo and Jackson Holliday and Samuel Basayo all spent time in AAA. Like, these guys are together and they're figuring it out together, how to win together, how to work together, how to operate on a day-to-day basis Tampa's doing the same thing right now. All those guys were in Double-A Montgomery. Carson Williams was there. Trey Morgan was there. Xavier Isaac was there. There are a couple others that I'm forgetting. Braden Taylor was there, and some pitchers as well. And then you think about the core four, quote unquote, in Boston before the White Sox acquired Teal. I mean, Teal was with Marcelo Meyer, was with Roman Anthony, was with Christian Campbell by the end of the year. All these guys get to develop this camaraderie. And when you see these waves, when you talk about the golden generation of a certain franchise, chances are a lot of these prospects came up together at the same time and they all had similar ETAs. And I think that's what the White Sox have pitching wise. I'm not saying that this is we're coming up on the golden generation of White Sox baseball, but we're coming up on the best pitching situation that we've seen since the mid 2000s.
05, yeah, probably. It's true. I mean, it's hard. Maybe 08. Maybe that team put some good pitching, but yeah.
And we're banking on promise, man. And I'm not saying that Schultz is going to be Burley, and I'm not saying that Thorpe is going to be John Garland. But at the end of the day, those guys were all good at the exact same time, and that's what created a good team. And I think the White Sox have set themselves up for 6 or 7 good starting pitching options, if it all works out, for quite some time.
I completely agree. And the other thing we've talked about too is this depth is never going to be a bad thing because a lot of these guys will become relievers, right? That's the reality of the situation is you're going to have to transition a good amount of these guys that have a bunch of stuff into high level relief arms. And that's going to help your bullpen too. So yes, there's a ton of starters and figuring out exactly where to stack them this season is going to be a little complicated because you only have a certain amount of guys that can start at the big league level. But there's a lot of these guys that you can eventually shift into a bullpen role and see them thrive. Like a guy like Juan Carrella is one that I've said for a while. Juan Carrella is really good. Is he a starter at the same level as a Schultz, a Smith, a Taylor? No. But if that doesn't, if those guys all hit the way we hope they're going to hit, Juan Carrella could be a nasty reliever. And there's a handful of other guys as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is the situation. Every college two-guard was a point guard in high school. You know what I mean? I don't want to say every, because there are some guys that come up as relievers now. I'm thinking about Kirkering and Philly and guys like that who are just, relievers in college. Then they're, quick ascension relievers in the minor leagues. But, I mean, you look at the majority of big league bullpens, the majority of those bullpens are made up of guys that started through the minor leagues and then adjusted to a relief role, and their stuff ticked up. I mean, I have spent the last 3 seasons in Indianapolis, and that bullpen in Pittsburgh is, former starter in Kyle Nicholas, former starter in Carmen Majinski, former starter in Dalry Moretta when he's, healthy. I think Bednar started some games when he was a lower level Padre. I mean, you've got all of these guys. They all started and they all came to grips with a reliever future at some point, and they got better and they figured out that is how they're going to make their generational wealth.
Definitely. That's 100%. On the hitting side, we'll flip because the White Sox pitching side is exciting. We all know it. We all love it. It's fun to watch. Hitting side, a little scarier, of course. This offense was, the worst in baseball by every single number you can find last season. There is a lot of holes to fill and a lot of guys that you are hoping can hit, but there's still some questions. So what do you see as, we talked about Caro and Teal, and I honestly think there's a chance that one of those guys breaks camp. I do think there's a world where they say, Edgar Caro, you proved enough last year, even with the minimal time in triple, where you're going to get it and Teal's going to join you in a month and you guys are going to be the catchers from now on. You seem to lean that they're going to take a month or two with those guys, which is probably a little bit more realistic. Aside from the catchers, who are the guys that are, still qualified as prospects that you see having a real shot to break camp? And outside of Meadroth, because we talked about him as well. But who are the guys that you think could really break camp? And if not break camp, make an impact pretty early in the season?
Yeah, so I was actually trying to search to push back on they were last in every single category, and I went to some niche categories. They were dead last in walks drawn. The other one I clicked on was triples, and they were the only team in Major League Baseball with fewer than 10 triples. So, they were last in the league in triples. How can you get more niche than that? So, I mean, just crazy. That's hard to fathom. Aside from my draw, how much more do you want to see from Colson in AAA is my big question. What does the Colson maturation look like? I think he repeats AAA this year. I think he's up at some point, obviously, because there's 0 point in him not being up in 2025. But, is he getting everyday third base reps in AAA now? That's what started to happen in the fall league. I mean, Brian Ramos, obviously. But, there aren't very many close proximity guys that I'm willing to just roll out there and say, yeah, you can absolutely be a part of the big league situation this year. I think Colson and Ramos are the two that you could ID right away, but the majority of your focus is on the pair of catchers, and then whatever Montgomery looks like when he does debut in minor league baseball.
Yeah.
What's your take on Ramos?
I've wanted to hold out on formulating one for a really long time. Just because I'm like, okay, he's getting up and then he's not getting the run to establish himself as a consistent big league piece. But that tells me what I need to know, I think, about Brian Ramos, where they don't trust him enough to be that everyday guy right now. 2025 is going to help me formulate my concrete opinion on Brian Ramos, but right now, like it's super vague, and my thought is, okay, he could be a decent bench piece that can pitch in at third and pitch in the DH role occasionally. I have no idea how they're going to use Miguel Vargas. Is he going to play corner outfield? Is he going to play second base?
they it seems to be like third is where they want him most, but then it's like what does that mean for Ramos even at that point?
Yeah, exactly. So like I could see Miguel Vargas playing 100 games at third and then 50 games at DH, and Ramos, is the bench piece and is playing 50 games at third base and then is filling in the DH role as well. I think he needs a bit more defensive versatility to be a big leaguer, to be honest.
Do you think there's a world he could play outfield? Because I honestly don't think Ramos' defense at third is bad. I've seen him. I mean, me and Jeff watched him at Charlotte when we were there in person last year, and I talked with him about it. And like, he looks like he's really improved at third over time. But at the same time, it's like I don't know if he's quite quick enough on his feet for the outfield. And I'm like, but then it's like, where does the outfield even work? Because you're locked into Benintendi. If you're not trading Luis Robert, he's in center, and then you have two different right fielders you just signed to platoon out there. So it's like, does Ramos just need to play second? But then you've still got Meadroth and Brooks Baldwin over there. So it's like.
I think he makes a crowded situation jam-packed if you get him reps at second base. What's weird to me, I just pulled up the game log. He made one start and left in Charlotte.
Right, I remember that.
Why one? Like get him 10. Send him to Charlotte and have him play left, 20 times in the first month, or in the first 2 months, split his time evenly between third and left. Have him figure that out, because that's the way he becomes a big league piece here, especially with Colson trending like he's going to be the third baseman, and you want him to be your everyday third baseman.
Yeah, it's an interesting, somewhat of a logjam, but it is. I mean, I think it's just you want to figure out this season obviously Colson is in your long-term plans, but like who of all these guys with Meadroth, with Baldwin, with Ramos, like who are the long-term pieces here? Like that is the biggest question right now this season for the offensive side. Like you feel great about your catching tandem, you feel really good about your pitching side. Who are the pieces in this offense that you're going to be able to pencil in for 2026 and beyond?
Okay, so building on that, I don't think you can answer that. And I don't think you could, be honest with yourself if you said, I know who's going to be that right now, because you don't. Like, I think that 2025 is an open audition for all of these guys. And, I watch the Pirates situation very closely, and they have this grouping of Nick Gonzalez, Nick York, Jared Triolo, Leover Peguero, Billy Cook. These are all guys that I think are big leaguers in some form or fashion, but there are not enough spaces for all of these guys. So 2025 is an open audition, and who's going to be in Indy, who's going to be in Pittsburgh. I think the White Sox is an identical conversation where you give all of these guys an audition before the All-Star break, and you start to get a little bit of clarity after the All-Star break.
Do you see we kind of feel like the White Sox are pointing to 2026, Jack. Do you see them flirting with 500 by then? Assuming that by then they've got a pretty solid rotation.
White Sox fans would hate to hear this, hate it, but it is a similar trajectory to what we've watched Oakland do in the last couple years, where the A's were, the doormat of Major League Baseball. And that was, I mean, they achieved new lows, and then the White Sox achieved new lows in 2024. But last year, Oakland showed us a bit of promise where it was like, I like this piece. I like this piece. I like this piece.
No.
I think that's what can happen in 2025, where you start to say, I like this piece. And I do think that mid 70 to high 70 is an achievable win total in 2026. Obviously not in 2025, but
Right.
I think that they can start to inch closer to 500 and be a team that is competing in a wide open division. I mean, we talk about that division, and obviously there were, three postseason teams in the American League Central. It was not a great division. Like all of these teams, okay, they were good. They were not great
Yeah.
teams. Like I didn't view any as a true World Series contender. This division is pretty wide open, and if they have pitching, why can't you be a poor man's version of the Mariners in 2026?
Well, that's it. I think pitching is the key for them, just like with the Pirates. In that, if you got pitching, all of a sudden you're competitive.
Yeah,
And
well, in Kansas City too. I mean, look in the same division, right? This year, who was that offense aside from Bobby Witt Jr.? I mean, there were weeks on end where there was nobody hitting in that lineup aside from Bobby, but they had two all-stars in Lugo and Reagans, and then they had Waka pitching out of his mind, and then they had Alec Marsh show up as well. Like the groundwork is in the division. Like you can see what Detroit did, you could see what Kansas City did, and they found their way into the postseason with not good offenses. Just replicate that.
all right.
Yeah, 100%. With that said, right, like those guys are all kind of figuring out the offense, auditioning. Is there any guys that you're particularly, I know we've talked about a few of these guys the last time I had you on. Is there any guys you're particularly looking forward to seeing the development of on the prospect side of things? Not the guys that are going to debut this year. Like there's a bunch of guys in the system that are still pretty interesting to check out at the lower levels. And I have a feeling of the one you're going to mention, but who at the lower levels on the hitting side do you see, some this year being a really big growth year for, even though they're nowhere near the major league, especially?
Thank you for teeing me up for this, Elijah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Riku Nishida. I said if we don't talk about Nishida, I'm going to be so upset. 50 plate appearances in Double-A to end the year. How many times did he strike out, Jeff, in those 50 plate appearances?
I think that would be zero.
Zero Ks in 50 plate appearances in Double-A. That was the hardest league. The Southern League was the hardest league to hit in minor league baseball this year. He's so wacky. He's fun. He's exciting. Like I watched him take on Snelling in Pensacola, and he drops a bunt down, then swipes second, and the next time he laces a single into center. Like he's fun, man, and I love that. And I think that kind of player is making its way back in to baseball. I think Chandler Simpson in Tampa, who swiped 100 bags this year in the minor leagues, like I'm not saying Nishida is an 100 stolen base candidate, but he could absolutely swipe 50 this year. He swiped 40 something last year. He got caught a lot, but that's okay. Like that's the burden of being really exciting. I think Nishida can be a 50 stolen base threat, and he hit over 300. I think he can hit in the high 200s, maybe 300, and he's not going to strike out. He walks enough. Yeah, there's zero power, but I do think that there's going to be a space for those kind of guys to compete. I'm really excited, and you help me with this. Is it Wolkow or Wolko? I think it's Wolkow.
Walkout. Yeah.
Wolkow. Yeah, like insane juice. I'm very excited. And like, I see the clips and I popped into some, lower level games and I was like, he looks the part at such a young age. So give me another year, give me another off season being a pro baseball player, and there's nothing on your agenda other than working out and then some personal advancement. If he wants to read, he can. Like, let me see what you can be after an off season of being a professional baseball player. So those are the two guys that are really ID saying, you know what, these are the two that I think could make leaps and bounds.
Yeah, I'm sure you haven't gotten to see much of him yet, and we haven't gotten to see much of him yet. But I've heard crazy high things about Caleb Bonnemer so far since the draft pick. That was the second rounder. I mean, I think he is a guy that I can't wait to see what he has to do. And I think he'll start in Arizona. He'll probably be in the complex league for at least a couple months, probably. But I think he, is someone who we're excited about from talking to guys last year in the fall. Like he gets a lot of rave reviews from the whole organization, and I think that he's someone who we're going to get, a taste of him in Kannapolis, hopefully similarly to how Walco was last year, right? Where he dominates in Arizona, gets up to Canny, and then you've got a duo with those two of two, 18-year-olds at this point. They're both 18 still in Kannapolis, hopefully later in the season next year.
Yeah, hopefully. And I haven't seen a lick of Bonnemer. All I read was, during the draft process where he was, initially mocked in like the middle of the first round, I was like, okay, like let me figure out a little bit something more about Caleb Bonarmer. And I just, it was fun to read about him. I'm excited to see what he does this year. But yeah, it would be at the complex. Like, I can't wait for that backfield grainy footage. It's like, oh, look at this shot, that kind of thing.
Yeah, he had a cool clip that was just like a scrimmage game in the fall where he just absolutely destroyed one to dead center, and I was like, okay, this is somebody I want to keep an eye on. So that's exciting there. The few other guys, I want to briefly mention Joral Perez and Alexander Albertus. Those are the two other guys that were, part of the Eric Fetty trade alongside Miguel Vargas. Joral Perez is someone who, I liked him as an acquisition in that trade. I think he, profiles as a second baseman. He definitely is limited, defensively and physically, but has a lot more pop than his, initial body may show. He pulls really well. He elevates the ball really well for a guy of his age and his size. And then Albertus was injured last year, but also a guy that, last year early in the season, I had heard some buzz from him in the Dodgers world about, this is a guy to keep an eye on a little bit at the lower levels. So Joral Perez, I think, is probably going to get a bump to high A next year, even though he's still pretty young. He had a whole season in single A last year. And then Albertus, I think, will be in single A, given that he's coming off an injury. Are those two guys, still, I know people hated that trade return and people still do hate that trade return, but like, are those guys still, exciting to watch for people a little bit this year?
Of course. I think people were initially turned off because we had that's it reaction to that trade where you're moving a Fetty who looked like a great movable deal and you should, capitalize, and you attach Kopech as well. And you saw what Kopech did with the Dodgers, man. I mean, he's disgusting. And I think every White Sox fan knew that Kopech had that in him. It might have just been a buy-in with the White Sox thing. Like, you had the feeling he was going to go to a contender and log a sub too, because that's what Kopech is. I think they were put behind the eight ball because of the initial reaction, but I'm excited to see them. Joral Perez, I was checking in on Josue De Paula, who's a top 100 prospect in baseball. In Rancho, I was like, okay, let me check in on the low A affiliate of the Dodgers. Let me see what's going on here. And, about a month and a half into the season in 2024, I pull up Rancho's, team numbers, and I'm like, okay, De Paula's been fine, but who is this Jay Perez cat? And then I did the dive, and I'm like, okay, yeah, he's not that big, but like you mentioned, he's got sneaky pop, and he's twitchy. He's got a lot of rotational excellence to him. So I'm excited to see how that continues to blossom as he gets to the upper levels. But he's a guy that popped 11 in 80-something games last year, 90-something games last year. So if he can turn into a 15 home run guy at this young of an age, that's really exciting. Albertus, I have no idea what to expect. The numbers are good. I haven't come close to seeing him. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, it's limited games, right? I mean, he dominated in Arizona, but it's like in the last 2 years combined, it's under 100 games. So it's really hard to gauge with him. But I do know that people like his tools. I think he's decently has a good arm, seems to be a solid hit tool. So we'll see what that develops. And I think at the least, it's another guy to just keep circled and watch a little bit.
For sure. Like, keep your eye on these two. But I would say get excited about some of the guys at the upper levels.
Yeah, I had a chance to see a lot of Joral Perez this year. Has a nice glove, and in terms of that power, he is thick. He is a strong-looking kid. He's got his man muscles.
Yeah, well, he was out there in the Futures game, and he was like, he didn't look young. And there are a lot of guys that look young. Like seeing Justin Crawford in Seattle in 2023, I was like, wow, you're small. Like, it's clear that you're one of the younger guys here, but Joral Perez, like, he blended in perfectly with the upper minors guys. And that's all you want from a 19-year-old that's at the lower levels is not look totally overmatched, and he didn't.
Yeah, one last guy I want to mention, but this is Arum's guy, so you may not be super familiar with him. Sam Antonacci is an interesting one. Arum, when we had Arum on last year, Arum was like, right after the White Sox had drafted him, he was like, this is the best draft pick they made in terms of value. I was like, okay, that's a big statement for a guy that, was a JUCO player and then went to Coastal Carolina for a season. But then me and Jeff were in, Kannapolis for a few games in August, and we were both within 3 days of watching him in person, like, this guy can hit. Like, this guy can flat out hit. Have you seen any of Antonacci?
No, I haven't seen a lick of him, but
Totally
I'm
fair. Totally
He was a
understandable.
Heartland Community College guy.
Yeah, he was a Heartland Community College guy. JUCO Player of the Year, goes to Coastal, hits almost 400 at Coastal, leads the. I think he was second. I think he was second in NCAA behind like Dylan Cruz in batting average or something like that. It was something ridiculous. Where like his first year in D1 ball, he was like top 3 in batting average in baseball, and he's just no power. He's nothing flashy, but the dude just flat out gets on base all the time.
Fire me up for that.
Right?
If he went to Heartland, I would assume he played. I played so many travel tournaments at
Yeah,
this
right.
place. The Corn Crib, you know what I'm talking about?
I do know
It
what
was
you're
like,
talking about. Actually, I played there once.
yeah, like college summer ball or indie ball. Like
Yeah.
the normal corn belters play at the Corn Crib, and I was like, wow, this is tough. It might be time to hang the cleats up.
Well, that's another guy to keep an eye on for you going forward. Jeff, you got anything else? I got one last question to finish on.
I don't have another question. I have one fun fact for Jack about the guy who's my favorite player as well, and that's Nishida. He had a game last year where he saw 36 pitches,
Whoa.
right? Because
Yeah.
that's his MO. He doesn't care about getting to 2 strikes, and he can foul off 10 pitches in a row if he's inclined to.
Dude, he's gonna piss people off, and I really like that. Like,
Yes.
and by people, I mean opposing pitchers. He's gonna make people really upset, make opposing pitchers really upset, and those are the kind of guys that I want in my 9-hole. And I'm not asking him to be a top of the line table setting leadoff guy. I'm asking him to be the most frustrating 9-hitter in baseball and swipe 30 bags a year. And I think that's what he can do.
Yeah, 100%. This is my last question for you, and I'm putting you on the spot. You've got to answer it. You're going to make White Sox fans either really happy here or really sad. Over under 49 and a half wins for the Chicago White Sox in 2025.
It's such a low number. It's so low. But I look at this offense, and this offense is worse than it was in 2024. I think they're going to get enough good starts, and I think we're going to get enough Schultz starts, and I think we'll get enough Hagen Smith starts at the end of the year to climb just over it. Give me 50.
Yes,
Give me
love
50.
it. Love it. I've got like 55, so I'm a little more high than you are,
Right.
but I will take the over from Jack McMullen.
You're in
Jack
fantasy
McMullen,
land. 50's realistic.
Okay, I'll be in fantasy land. Jack McMullen of Just Baseball and the Indianapolis Indians, folks, at Jack_McMullen. This guy is awesome. He is great with prospects, with regular baseball, Just Baseball show, call up, all of the above. Make sure to check him out online. Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your favorite baseball team.
Appreciate you guys for having me. It was great.
Thanks.